I still remember the look on my mother's face when I finally told her that I was dropping out of the pre-med program she had spent 18 years grooming me for. All because of a girl who couldn't even walk. It sounds cold when I say it like that, doesn't it? But you have to understand that my entire life had been a carefully constructed prison of perfection. Until the day I met Elara. My parents didn't see a daughter. They saw a trophy, a future surgeon who would validate their social standing. But Elara saw someone who was suffocating under the weight of a golden crown. People always ask me if I regret throwing away a $1 million career for a girl the rest of the world had written off. But looking back at the wreckage of my perfect life, I only have one question for you. Was I wrong for choosing a soul over a hollow success? Or would you have stayed in the cage just because it was made of gold? I really need you to think about that as I tell you how a girl in a wheelchair managed to dismantle a lifetime of expectations in just 6 months. My life, before Elara, was a series of timed intervals and high-pressure achievements. I was the perfect kid in our affluent suburban neighborhood. Straight as captain of the debate team, and a volunteer record that looked like it was written by a saint. My father was a high-powered corporate attorney, and my mother was a perfectionist who viewed a B+ as a personal insult to our bloodline. From the time I was 5, my path was set. I was going to Johns Hopkins, I was going to specialize in neurosurgery, and I was going to marry someone from a similar pedigree. I didn't have hobbies. I had extracurriculars. I didn't have friends. I had networking opportunities. Every morning I woke up at 5 to run 5 miles. Not because I liked running, but because physical discipline mirrors mental acuity, or at least that's what my father shouted from the treadmill next to mine. I was a machine, a high-functioning biological computer designed to output prestige. By the time I reached my sophomore year of college, the cracks were starting to show, though I was an expert at hiding them behind expensive coffee and a practiced smile. I was exhausted, hollowed out, and beginning to realize that I didn't actually like science or medicine, or the people I was surrounded by. Every lecture felt like a funeral for my own desires. I would sit in the front row of organic chemistry, taking meticulous notes while my mind drifted to the melodies I heard in my head. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade panic that I would be found out. That someone would see through the 4.0 GPA and realize there was nothing underneath, but a desperate need for approval. My parents checked my grades online every Friday. They tracked my location via my phone. They even vetted my study groups, to ensure I wasn't wasting time with people who weren't on a similar upward trajectory. The psychological weight was immense. I felt like a bridge held together by nothing but habit and fear, waiting for the one gust of wind that would bring it all down. I was 20 years old, and I didn't even know what my favorite food was because I only ate what was optimal for cognitive performance. Meals were fuel, sleep was a biological necessity to be minimized, and joy was a distraction to be avoided. My father often said that emotions are the friction that slows down progress. And for 2 decades, I believed him. I silenced the part of me that wanted to scream, the part that wanted to create, the part that wanted to just exist without being measured. Then came the mandatory community service hours for my honors scholarship. I was assigned to a local rehabilitation center, a place filled with the smells of antiseptic and the sounds of struggle. I hated it at first. It felt messy and unpredictable, 2 things my life never allowed for. That was where I saw her. Elara was sitting by a large window in the common room, her legs covered by a colorful knitted blanket, staring out at a blooming cherry blossom tree with an intensity that made me stop in my tracks. She wasn't like the other patients who looked defeated or the volunteers who looked pitying. She looked present. When I was assigned to be her reading companion, I walked over with my usual clinical efficiency, ready to check the box and move on. I introduced myself with my full title and my intended career path, expecting her to be impressed like everyone else usually was. Instead, she just looked at me, her dark eyes scanning my face with a terrifying level of perception, and said, "You look like you're holding your breath. You should probably exhale before you pass out on my shoes." That was the first time anyone had actually looked at me, rather than threw me at my resume. Over the next few weeks, my sessions with Elara became the only part of my day that didn't feel like a performance. Elara had been in a car accident 3 years prior that had paralyzed her from the waist down, and taken the lives of both her parents. She had every reason to be bitter, to be angry, to hide away from a world that had been so cruel to her. Yet, she spent her days painting vibrant landscapes and writing poetry that pulsed with a life I had never felt. She started challenging me. She would ask me why I wanted to be a doctor, and when I gave her the rehearsed speech about saving lives and advancing science, she would laugh and tell me I sounded like a brochure. She pushed me to admit that I loved music, that I secretly spent my few free minutes listening to indie folk bands, and wishing I could play the guitar that had been gathering dust in my closet since I was 10 because my mother deemed it a distraction. We would talk for hours about things that didn't matter to my parents but mattered to the world. The way light hits the water at dusk, the specific feeling of a minor chord, the fear of being forgotten. She told me about the night of the accident, how she had been a competitive dancer with a scholarship to Juilliard, and how in 1 second, her entire identity was stripped away. She told me that losing everything was the most terrifying thing that ever happened to her, but it was also the most liberating because she finally had to figure out who she was when she wasn't the dancer. I realized then that I was still in the dancer phase of my life, except I wasn't even the one dancing. My parents were pulling the strings. I started sneaking my guitar into the center. We would hide in the small courtyard where the security cameras didn't reach, and I would play songs I'd written in the margins of my biology textbooks. For the first time, I wasn't playing for a grade or a recital. I was playing because the sound made Elara smile, and that smile felt more like an achievement than any medical school acceptance letter ever could. Our conversations became the highlight of my week, then my day. I started bringing her art supplies, vibrant oils and thick canvases, that my parents would have called clutter. I watched her hands move with a precision that was different from the surgical precision I was being taught. Her precision was about creation, while mine was about maintenance. She noticed the smallest details about me. The way I bit my lip when I was stressed, the way my eyes lit up when I talked about a certain melody, and the way I would subconsciously check my watch every 10 minutes because of my father's schedule. She told me once, "You spend so much time preparing for a life you haven't started yet that you're missing the one you're actually in." That sentence haunted me. I would go home to my parents' cold, modern house where every surface was polished and every word was measured, and I felt like a stranger. My mother would talk about the plan, as if it were a holy scripture. She had even started looking at wedding venues for a future I hadn't agreed to, with a man I hadn't even met yet, but who was perfectly suitable. Elara showed me that perfection is just a polite word for being finished, and she wasn't finished. She was living more deeply in her chair than I was on my 2 working legs. As we grew closer, I started skipping my mandatory, networking mixers to spend more time at the center. I started laughing. But as I began to wake up, my parents began to notice the change. The perfect kid was slipping. My grades dipped from a 4.0 to a 3.8, which in my house was treated like a felony. My mother found a painting Elara had made for me, a bright, messy depiction of a bird breaking through a glass ceiling, and she threw it in the trash, calling it sentimental garbage from a girl who clearly has nothing better to do than distract you from your destiny. The tension in my house became unbearable. My mother started showing up at the university unannounced, checking my library records and questioning my professors. She even called the rehabilitation center, trying to get me reassigned to a different patient, claiming Elara was a bad influence on a focused mind. I remember one night, standing in the kitchen, listening to my father calculate how much money they had invested in my future, as if I were a stock option rather than a human being. He told me that my duty was to the family legacy, not to my fanciful whims. I realized then that their love was entirely conditional. If I stopped being the perfect kid, the love would stop too. It was a terrifying revelation. For 20 years I had thought I was loved, but I was actually just being managed. I felt like a piece of high-end equipment that was starting to malfunction. My father's voice would drop into that low, courtroom register, explaining why individual happiness is secondary to familial stability. My mother would play the martyr, talking about all the sacrifices she made, the career she gave up to raise me, the social events she navigated to build my network, as if I owed her my soul as repayment. I felt like I was drowning, and Elara was the only one offering me a hand. I started lying to them, telling them I was at the lab when I was actually at the hospital helping Elara with her physical therapy, or taking her to the park. I saw the way people looked at her, sometimes with pity, sometimes with a weird kind of inspiration porn gaze, and I saw how she handled it with a grace I could never dream of. She didn't want to be anyone's hero. She just wanted to be Elara. And I just wanted to be the person she saw when she looked at me. I began to realize that the million-dollar career my parents wanted for me was actually a life sentence of misery. I saw the surgeons my parents admired. They were divorced, stressed, and fueled by caffeine and ego. Was that what I wanted? Or did I want to be the guy playing guitar in a tiny apartment for a girl who actually knew my middle name? The pressure was building like a tea kettle about to whistle. I was skipping more classes. I was spending my scholarship money on paint and strings instead of textbooks. I was staying out late, watching the stars with Elara, listening to her talk about the dreams she still had despite everything. She wanted to open a studio for disabled artists. She wanted to travel to Paris. She wanted things that were impossible according to my parents' logic. But with her, they felt inevitable. The contrast was becoming too much to bear. I would spend the morning in a sterile lab, dissecting cadavers, and the afternoon in a sunlit room, watching Elara bring a canvas to life. One felt like death, and the other felt like a beginning. My parents' investigation into Elara wasn't just about her health. They were looking for a way to discredit her. They looked into her parents' estate, her medical bills, everything. They wanted to prove she was using me. It was so far from the truth it was laughable. She was the only person in the world who didn't want anything from me except my company. So that's the situation I was in. I was standing at a literal crossroads. Stay the course, become the wealthy, miserable surgeon my parents wanted, and keep the perfect life, or walk away from everything I'd ever known to support a girl who taught me how to breathe, even if it meant being disowned and broke. Before I tell you the absolute chaos that happened during my final confrontation with my parents, and how Elara reacted to my sacrifice, I want you to pause right now. Go to the comments and tell me, honestly, would you have the courage to blow up a guaranteed future of wealth and status for a chance at being yourself? Or am I just a reckless fool who got swept up in a moment of emotion? I really want to see your perspective on this because it's a choice that still keeps me up at night. After the midterm exams where I intentionally performed just average, the explosion finally happened. My parents sat me down in our pristine living room, a room that felt more like a museum than a home, and told me they had investigated the girl at the center. They had pulled her medical records through a friend at the hospital, which I'm pretty sure was a massive HIPAA violation, and they used her disability as a weapon against her. They spoke about Elara as if she were a parasite, a broken person trying to drag a whole person down to her level. My mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "Do you really think a girl like that can offer you anything? She'll be a burden on your career, your social life, and your finances. You're throwing away a Ferrari for a broken bicycle." The cruelty of that statement was the final straw. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about her. They were attacking the most beautiful thing I had ever found. My father told me I was forbidden from seeing her, and that I was to transfer to a university in a different state by next semester. He had already contacted the admissions office. He had already decided my life for me again. In that moment, something inside me didn't just crack, it shattered. I looked at the two people who had provided for me, clothed me, and paid for everything, and I realized they didn't know a single thing about who I was. They didn't love me. They loved the idea of me. I told them no. I told them I was quitting pre-med. I was staying here, and I was going to help Elara move into her own apartment and find a way to finish her degree while I pursued music and teaching. I told them that the only broken people in this room were them, because they were incapable of seeing value in anything that didn't have a price tag. The aftermath was brutal. My father told me to leave that night. He said if I wasn't going to be the son they designed, I wasn't their son at all. He literally took my car keys and my credit cards right then and there. I packed one bag, took my guitar and walked out into the rain, feeling a strange, terrifying sense of lightness. I had exactly $42 in my pocket and nowhere to go. I walked for 3 miles until I reached the center. When Elara saw me standing there, soaked and homeless but smiling, she cried for the first time. She told me she never wanted to be the reason I lost my family, but I told her she wasn't the reason. She was the catalyst. The struggle that followed was more intense than any organic chemistry final. I was working 3 jobs, one at a 24-hour diner, one as a night security guard, and another doing freelance transcription. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. I lived on coffee and the adrenaline of independence. Elara was released from the center a month later, and we moved into a tiny studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. The elevator broke down once a week, and I had to carry her up 3 flights of stairs, but we would just laugh about it. We were broke, we were tired, and we were completely free. I remember one specific night when the heating went out in the middle of January. We huddled together under every blanket we owned, and I played my guitar to keep her distracted from the cold. She told me that night that she had never felt safer, even when she was living in her parents' mansion. That was the moment I knew I had won. My parents tried one last time to buy me back. They sent a lawyer to my workplace with a contract. If I left Elara and returned to med school, they would set up a trust fund that would make me a multimillionaire by 30. I looked at that piece of paper, the physical manifestation of their control, and I ripped it in half. I laughed in his face and told him to tell my parents that I was already richer than they would ever be. That was the final nail in the coffin. My parents haven't spoken to me in 5 years. They didn't come to my graduation, where I walked across the stage to receive my degree in music education with Elara cheering from the front row. They didn't send a card when I got my first job at a local high school, a job where I actually look forward to Monday mornings. They missed the gallery opening where Elara sold her first major collection of paintings. Paintings that now hang in galleries across the country, and tell the story of a girl who found her wings in a chair. They think I failed. They think I'm a perfect kid gone wrong. But when I come home to our accessible little house, and I see Elara working on a new piece, or we spend the evening composing a song together, I know I've never been more successful. My life is now a series of small, meaningful moments instead of high-stakes performances. I spend my days teaching kids how to find their own voices through music, and my evenings with the woman who taught me how to find mine. Sometimes I see my father's name in the news for some big corporate merger, and I feel a pang of something, not regret but a weird kind of pity. He's still in the cage. He's still running on that treadmill, shouting at a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. He has the money, the cars, and the perfect reputation, but he doesn't have a son who wants to talk to him. I wonder if he ever looks at the empty room at the end of the hall and realizes that he didn't just lose a doctor. He lost a child. My mother, I hear, still tells her friends that I'm traveling abroad or working on a research project, unable to admit that her masterpiece walked away and started over. But then I look at Elara, and I realize that the cost of admission to my new life was high, but it was worth every single cent. I have a life built on truth now. I traded a life of being a trophy for a life of being a man. I lost a fortune, but I found my soul, and I found a partner who loves me for my flaws, not my GPA. Elara didn't just change my life. She saved it by showing me that being broken and real is infinitely better than being perfect and empty. This journey taught me that the people who demand perfection from you usually only love the image you project, not the human being you actually are. It takes a lot of pain to realize that someone's disappointment in you is often just the sound of their control slipping away. I'm sharing this because I know there are others out there living a life that was written for them by someone else. Maybe you're the perfect kid too. Or maybe you're the one everyone has written off. If you're waiting for permission to be yourself, consider this it. It won't be easy, and you might lose things you thought were essential: money, status, the approval of people who don't really know you. But I promise you that the view from the other side is worth every struggle. I've seen the way people change when they stop trying to be what they're told to be and start being who they are. It's like a light turning on in a dark room. You realize that all those expectations were just shadows on the wall. Like this video if you think I made the right choice by standing by Elara and choosing my own path. And definitely subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who had the guts to start over. I'd love to hear your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments. Did my parents have a point about the investment? Or were they totally out of line? Have you ever had to walk away from everything to save yourself? Share your story, let's talk about it. I'll see you all in the next story.